All right, so I'm going to start this video with a little bit of a story. So a couple months ago now, I think it was like 4 or 5 months ago, I was watching this video on YouTube, just trying to get some input. It just randomly popped up on my feed. And I'm studying Southern Vietnamese, right? So I click on this video. The Southern dialect and the Northern dialect sound very different from each other. And so you can instantly tell when somebody's speaking with a Northern accent or a Southern accent. And so I had clicked on this video assuming the girl was speaking in a Southern accent. I had watched about maybe it was a 10-minute video. I was like 6 minutes in, and my comprehension was really high, and I was actually feeling like pretty proud of myself for being able to understand so much. I think I was at like if I were to estimate, like 95% comprehension. There's barely any words she was saying that I wasn't understanding. And then she said a word with a tone that was the wrong tone for the word. Now, Vietnamese is a tonal language, so tones are super important, and native speakers will never mess up a tone because it's just so internalized within them that they just always say the tones correctly. It's very rare when like the native speaker would say the wrong tone, especially like the word that she said. It was like a very basic word and she used a completely different tone. And so I was super confused at this. And I started looking at the comments to see if somebody would be like, oh, you used the wrong tone on that word or something like that. And when I was scrolling through the comment section, everybody was talking about, oh, you have such a cute accent. Your accent is like really cute. And then I saw this one comment that said like, imagine if there's a foreigner listening to this, he would never be able to understand your accent. And I got like really confused. I was like, what? Like, what are they talking about? And then I realized that this girl was actually speaking with a central accent. And I started paying close attention to her voice. And then I started to realize that, oh yeah, she's saying the tones pretty differently from what I'm actually used to hearing. And so the crazy thing about this was that I was understanding this video as if she didn't even have an accent, which some people might think is a really good thing. Like, oh, you can actually understand like both of these like Southern and Central dialects equally as well. This is a really good thing. But in my opinion, this was actually like a sign that something was terribly wrong with my comprehension. And this is because I couldn't even notice that she had an accent until she said a word that like, the word that she said was like one of the most common words in Vietnamese. I don't remember what it was, but I remember it was a very, very common word that I heard like thousands and thousands of times. And so I played the video for my wife, who's a native speaker. And as soon as she heard like the first word, she's like, oh my gosh, she has such a strong central accent. Fast forward a couple months later, I get a notification from YouTube. Matt versus Japan posted in his community that he's opening up like a school community where he's like doing like live lectures, and it's only $20 a month. So I'm like, okay, this is a cool opportunity. Let me sign up and maybe learn something new. And I joined Matt versus Japan's school, which I think is worth it. Honestly, he provides pretty good content in there. Obviously, I'm not like affiliated with him or anything, but in the school community, he talks a lot about the importance of listening and how reading can actually damage your accent. And I thought about how a lot of people who study Japanese by reading end up not acquiring pitch accent, right? And I made this connection in my head between the Japanese pitch accent and Vietnamese tones. So with Vietnamese tones, if you do not speak with the correct tone, nobody will understand you. You'll be completely misunderstood. So you absolutely need to speak with the right tones. With Japanese, you can use incorrect pitch accent patterns because they're not as important for comprehension as tones. They're important to sound like a native and be able to speak fluidly. And every once in a while, it can confuse them. But if you speak with wrong pitch accent patterns, they'll still understand you. Whereas Vietnamese, they can't understand anything you're saying if you don't speak with the right tones. And so a lot of people end up studying Japanese by reading. When you're reading written Japanese, the pitch accent is not indicated on the characters or the letters at all, right? And so if you do not know the pitch accent pattern of that word, you might end up making a pattern up in your head. And so when you're reading like extensively in Japanese, you can end up building incorrect habits of reading wrong pitch accents in your head, and you can end up fossilizing those patterns so that when you go to speak those words, you're speaking those words with those wrong pitch accent patterns that you invented in your head while reading. And so Matt versus Japan was kind of coming from that angle of pitch accent in Japanese. And that line of reasoning made me realize, going back to the video that I was talking about that I watched in Vietnamese, where I kind of came to this realization that when I read Vietnamese, I'm not actually reading the tones. I'm just reading for the meaning only. And so I cut corners in pronunciation in my head. So the way that Vietnamese is written, I'll put a picture up on the screen. It's written in the Latin script. And so I've actually like seen people who have never studied Vietnamese in their life that can just read it out loud. And of course the pronunciation is wrong, but they can actually kind of do it a little bit. And because Vietnamese is written in the Latin script, it makes it easier for you to just pronounce things the English way in your head. So I'll give you an example. All right. So then the word in Vietnamese for like name, like what's your name, is tân, right? So like it's a neutral tone, but the way that it's spelled, it kind of looks like the word for 10, like as in like 10 of something in English. And so a lot of people, when they read Vietnamese, they just read 10, right? And so because it's hard to reprogram your brain to read this word as tân, like my inner monologue would just say 10, right? Because my brain is trying to optimize the way it reads Vietnamese. And I know when I see this word, I know it means name, right? And so my brain takes a shortcut of like, why go through the effort of pronouncing this properly in your head when you could just say 10 and you already know that it means name. And so I realized that what I was doing was that I was reading Vietnamese in my head as if it was English, and then I was making inferences based off the context of the text to determine what I was actually saying. And so I started running this experiment on myself. I was reading an article in my head, and I was actually paying attention for the first time, actually paying attention to my internal monologue. And I realized that I was reading every word with the wrong tones. I was just making up the tones in my head. Like the tones are indicated on the word, and I was just ignoring it and just pretty much saying everything with like English pronunciation. So I'll give you another example. So the Vietnamese word for blood is pronounced huic, right? And so I would read it, it ends with a T, right? But in Southern Vietnamese, you almost want to pronounce that like as if it's a C. And because in Southern Vietnamese, the way that the word is written is not the exact same way as it's pronounced. And so I'm pronouncing words as they were written, which makes me sound unnatural again. I know that word really well because I've seen it a lot. And so I'll just read it as huit, right? As if it was like an English word, like huit. And so like when I'm reading in my monologue in my head, will just be like, Ka rất là nhiều huit, instead of Ka rất là nhiều huit. You know what I mean? So the brain is an extremely efficient machine, and it likes to conserve as much energy as possible. So unless you're intentionally monitoring the way that you're reading, it's just going to read it in the simplest way possible to basically get the meaning across, which is giving you bad input, because when you're reading, you're actually speaking it in your head and giving yourself input. And so at this point, I spent like a year reading substantially more than I was listening. And so the majority of my Vietnamese input, to this day, by the way, has been toneless, broken accent Vietnamese rather than high quality native level input, which is why I speak poorly a lot of the time. And so once I realized the effect that this was having on my Vietnamese and how poor my input quality was because of the way I was reading, I basically completely cut out reading, and I switched to a listening only approach, and I was doing accent training. So what I would do is I would find a native speaker, I'd get a clip of what they're saying, and then I would put it into a software like Audacity, and I'd basically just listen and repeat over and over again until I sounded good. And this fixed my accent a lot. My accent is still not that good, and I'm still working on improving it, but going audio only drastically improved my results. And so it's kind of interesting, because if you were to ask me like, oh, should you just go audio only to begin with? I would say probably, but the thing is, I did still learn a lot of words. Like I'd say 90% of the words I know right now are because of that year-long reading grind stretch. I've been doing audio and listen and repeat type exercises exclusively, no reading at all, for the past couple months now. And I actually went back and tried to read again. And I noticed that this time I was actually able to read correctly in my head with very little effort. So when I was reading in my head, I was actually saying the right tones, which means that my ability to hear tones has drastically improved. because now I'm actually applying the right tone in my head, and I'm no longer doing that type of thing where I'm just reading toneless and then using context to infer what I'm trying to say. But I did notice that with new words where I've never seen them before, I actually would end up reading toneless again. And so it's still something that exists within my psyche. So it's still not safe for me to reintroduce reading. But there is improvement, which means that I didn't permanently ruin myself or anything like that. So if I were to give you like some kind of takeaway from this video, I would say if you're considering reading as your main method of getting good at a language, if your main goal is to listen and speak well, I would say be careful. There's a couple of factors that will make it worse. Number one, if your language is written in a Latin script, it's actually a disadvantage, in my opinion, because it can be very easy for your brain to resort to English-like pronunciation habits in order to expedite the process of understanding the meaning at the expense of having poor input given to you, right? So be careful with that. Ways to alleviate that problem: read with the audio transcript. So if you're listening and reading at the same time, your brain doesn't have to be the one that's narrating it because you have the native speaker narrating it as well. So that's really good. If you don't have access to the transcript, then I would say as long as you're listening to high quality native content more than you're reading, then I think that you're fine. Because in my case, my reading input drastically outweighed my listening. So most of my input was bad. So I'd say to avoid making the same mistake as me, if you're reading with a Latin script, either listen much more than you read or read with the native audio. Another thing I'd say is watch out for if your language has inconsistent spelling. Like English, for example, has spelling that's not perfectly consistent with the way you're going to pronounce it. And with that, if you read a word and you've never heard it spoken before, you're going to end up reading it wrong and you're going to end up speaking it wrong in the future. The example I gave is how I used to pronounce the word for blood as wheat, like with a T at the end, when really it's pronounced wheat with a kind of like a C kind of sound at the end. It's kind of hard to explain. So I intend on providing an update video in the future where I'm speaking pretty much fluently with no tone errors and I'm speaking really, really well. So I'm going to continue to grind. I'm going to continue to refine and perfect my accent. Well, I say perfect. I'm not going to get like a native accent, but just sounding decent and fluent. So I'm going to provide an update on that once I kind of get there. But for now, it's still going to be a little bit of a grind for me. If you found this video insightful in a way and you're able to kind of learn from my mistakes, that's pretty much my goal. So please let me know. Thank you for watching.